In 1954, a 67-year-old widow named Margaret Collins woke up every morning at 5:30 in Dayton, Ohio. For nearly 20 years, she worked as a seamstress, stitching dresses for other families while raising 3 children and caring for her aging sister. Her days were long, her hands always busy, but every evening at exactly 6, she placed a warm casserole in the center of a worn wooden table. That dish had one job: feed everyone. No waste. No complaints. Just quiet gratitude and full plates. Margaret did this every single day for over a decade. Different casseroles. Same purpose. Meals that stretched, meals that mattered, meals that held a family together when money was tight but dignity was not. These were not fancy recipes. They were honest ones. Built from what was on hand, guided by instinct, and often inspired by pages from a well-worn Betty Crocker's picture cookbook. These are their meals. Here are 10 of them. Creamed tuna and pea casserole. The ingredients were always simple. A can of tuna. A small handful of peas. A scoop of cooked noodles. A can of cream soup. A splash of milk. Crushed crackers on top. That was all Margaret needed most nights when time and money both felt tight. She would stir everything together in a single bowl, no fuss, no measuring cups. Then it went straight into the oven until the top turned golden and the smell filled the small kitchen. In less than an hour, dinner was ready. Filling. Reliable. In 1956, a bus driver named Leonard Hayes in Des Moines, Iowa depended on this exact meal after 12-hour shifts. He drove the same route for nearly 15 years, often coming home past sunset. His wife would leave this casserole covered on the stove. He said the first bite always felt like someone was waiting for him, even on the longest days. In 2024 dollars, this entire dish costs about $4.80 to make, feeding a full family with leftovers to spare. It takes around 45 minutes from start to finish. For seniors, this meal quietly delivers protein from the tuna, helping maintain muscle strength with age. Back in the 1950s, tuna casseroles like this became a staple after being popularized in community cookbooks and widely supported by brands promoting canned goods as modern convenience foods. It was not just a casserole. It was a system. A way to make sure no one at the table went to bed hungry. Hamburger potato layer bake. Ground beef. Thin slices of potato. A small onion. A can of tomato soup. A little salt and pepper. That was all it took to build something that could feed a full table without stretching a paycheck too far. Margaret would layer it slowly. Potatoes first. Then browned beef with onions. Then a thin pour of soup mixed with a bit of water. She repeated the layers once more, pressing it down gently with the back of a spoon. Into the oven it went, covered, until the potatoes softened and everything settled together into one steady, comforting dish. No stirring. No checking every minute. Just patience. In 1958, a factory worker named Daniel Brooks in Gary, Indiana relied on this meal after long shifts at the steel mill. He worked 6 days a week for over a decade, coming home with tired hands and heavy boots. His wife made this casserole twice a week. He used to joke that the potatoes knew exactly when he walked through the door because the smell would greet him before anyone else did. In 2024 dollars, this dish costs about $6.20 and feeds 6 people without leaving anyone wanting more. It takes about 1 hour and 10 minutes to prepare and cook. For seniors, the ground beef provides vitamin B12, which supports memory and energy levels. Meals like this became widely known during the 1950s as layered casseroles appeared in church cookbooks and family kitchens across industrial towns. It was simple. It was steady. And it never failed the people who depended on it. Chicken rice cream bake. A handful of cooked chicken. A cup of rice. A can of cream soup. A little milk. A pinch of salt. Sometimes a few celery pieces if they were left in the fridge. That was enough to build something that felt like more than the sum of its parts. Margaret would mix everything in one bowl, slowly, making sure the rice soaked up the creamy base. She would pour it into a baking dish and smooth the top with the back of a spoon. Into the oven it went until it thickened and held together like something meant to last. No rushing. No guessing. Just a quiet kind of certainty that it would turn out right. In 1955, a school janitor named Harold Whitman in Topeka, Kansas depended on this dish after evening shifts. He had worked in the same school for nearly 18 years, locking doors long after the children had gone home. His wife often saved the last portion for him, wrapped and waiting. He once said it tasted even better when the house was quiet and the day was finally over. And on Sundays, he always took the biggest portion, claiming it was for strength, though everyone at the table knew it was simply his favorite. In 2024 dollars, this meal costs about $5.10 and can feed a family of 6 with careful portions. It takes around 50 minutes from start to finish. For seniors, this dish offers steady protein from the chicken, helping maintain muscle health over time. Chicken and rice casseroles became common in the 1950s as canned soups made one-dish meals easier for working families. It was calm. It was dependable. And it always made enough. Macaroni tomato beef casserole. A small handful of macaroni. A bit of ground beef. A can of tomatoes. A chopped onion. A pinch of salt. Sometimes a sprinkle of cheese if there was a little left. That was all it took to make something that could carry a family through the evening. Margaret would cook the macaroni until soft, then mix it with browned beef and onions. She poured in the tomatoes, stirred slowly, and let everything come together in one dish. It went into the oven just long enough for the flavors to settle and the top to gently firm. No complicated steps. Just one pan, one purpose. In 1957, a grocery clerk named Samuel Turner in Tulsa, Oklahoma depended on this meal after long hours on his feet. He had worked at the same store for over 12 years, memorizing prices, greeting the same faces every week. His wife made this casserole often because it stretched easily. He used to laugh and say it tasted even better the next day, though he rarely left enough behind to prove it. In 2024 dollars, this dish costs about $5.60 and feeds 6 people without waste. It takes around 55 minutes to prepare and cook. For seniors, the tomatoes provide potassium, which supports heart health and steady blood pressure. Dishes like this became popular in the 1950s as families leaned on pantry staples and simple pasta meals that could be prepared in one dish. It was filling. It was familiar. And it always showed up when it was needed most. Egg noodle tuna bake. Wide egg noodles. A can of tuna. A can of cream soup. A splash of milk. A small handful of peas. Crushed chips or crackers on top if there were any left in the cupboard. That was all it took to build something steady and filling. Margaret would cook the noodles until soft, then fold them together with the tuna and soup, adding just enough milk to loosen everything. She would pour it into a baking dish, smooth the top, and sprinkle whatever crumbs she had for a light crust. Into the oven it went until it bubbled gently and the edges turned just a little crisp. It was not fancy. It did not need to be. In 1959, a telephone operator named Ruth Keller in Scranton, Pennsylvania relied on this meal between long evening shifts. She worked the switchboard for nearly 14 years, listening to voices connect and disconnect all night. Some evenings she would hum softly while eating, saying the quiet kitchen felt almost too still after a room full of ringing lines. And every now and then, she added extra crumbs on top, calling it her celebration version, even if there was nothing special to celebrate. In 2024 dollars, this dish costs about $4.90 and feeds 6 people with careful portions. It takes around 50 minutes from start to finish. For seniors, this meal provides protein from the tuna, helping support strength and daily energy. Tuna noodle casseroles became widely known in the late 1950s as canned goods and quick meals were promoted in everyday American kitchens. It was simple. It was warm. And it always did exactly what it needed to do. Cornbread ground beef bake. Crumbled cornbread. A bit of ground beef. A small onion. A can of tomatoes. A pinch of salt. Sometimes a spoon of drippings if there was any left in the pan. That was all it took to build a meal that felt older than the decade itself. Margaret would brown the beef with onions, then stir in the tomatoes and let it sit for a moment. In a baking dish, she layered the crumbled cornbread on the bottom, poured the beef mixture over it, and added another thin layer of cornbread on top. Into the oven it went until everything held together and the top turned slightly firm. It was the kind of dish that looked humble but carried weight. In 1953, a railroad worker named Thomas Avery in Jackson, Mississippi depended on this meal after long days along the tracks. He had worked the rails for over 22 years, walking miles each day under the sun. His wife made this casserole because it stayed filling for hours. He used to say it sat heavy in the right way, the kind of meal that did not leave you thinking about food again too soon. And once, after a long Sunday, he ate 2 full portions and quietly blamed the cornbread for being too easy to trust. In 2024 dollars, this dish costs about $5.30 and feeds 6 people without strain. It takes about 1 hour to prepare and cook. For seniors, the ground beef provides vitamin B12, supporting energy and nerve health. Cornbread-based casseroles trace back to Southern cooking traditions and carried into the 1950s as families blended older recipes with newer one-dish meals. It was steady, it was rooted, and it always stayed with you a little longer. Creamy potato ham bake. Sliced potatoes. Small bits of ham. A can of cream soup. A splash of milk. A little onion if it was available. That was enough to turn leftovers into something that felt intentional. Margaret would layer the potatoes first, then scatter pieces of ham across them. She poured the creamy mixture over everything, letting it sink down between the layers. Slow baking did the rest. The potatoes softened, the ham warmed through, and the whole dish settled into something steady and filling without any need for attention once it was in the oven. In 1956, a postal worker named Edward Miller in St. Louis, Missouri relied on this meal after walking long delivery routes through every kind of weather. He had worked the same neighborhood for nearly 15 years, knowing every porch step and mailbox by memory. His wife often made this casserole when there was leftover ham from Sunday dinners. He used to say it felt like the week was starting over in a good way when he came home to it. On cold evenings, he would sit by the kitchen window just to watch the steam rise from his plate before taking the first bite. In 2024 dollars, this dish costs about $5.80 and feeds 6 people comfortably. It takes around 1 hour and 5 minutes to prepare and bake. For seniors, this meal provides protein from ham, supporting muscle maintenance and daily strength. Potato casseroles became especially common in the 1950s as canned soups and baked dishes helped families stretch simple ingredients into full meals. It was warm, it was practical, and it always made leftovers feel new again. Beef and green bean bake. Ground beef. Canned green beans. A can of cream soup. A small onion. A pinch of salt and pepper. That was enough to turn a few simple ingredients into a full family meal. Margaret would brown the beef first, letting the onions soften right alongside it. Then she would fold in the green beans and cream soup, stirring slowly until everything blended into one thick, steady mixture. She would pour it into a baking dish and smooth it flat. Into the oven it went until it bubbled at the edges and held its shape like a meal meant to last. In 1958, a factory foreman named Robert Hayes in Cleveland, Ohio depended on this dish after 12-hour shifts overseeing machinery in a steel plant. He had worked the same job for over 16 years, coming home with soot on his hands and silence in his thoughts. His wife made this casserole on busy weeks when time was short. He used to sit at the table without speaking for a few minutes before eating, saying it helped him come back to himself. One winter night, after a particularly long shift, he finished the entire dish and quietly asked for seconds, even though there were none left. In 2024 dollars, this meal costs about $5.40 and feeds 6 people with ease. It takes around 50 minutes from start to finish. For seniors, green beans provide fiber, which supports digestion and heart health. Green bean casseroles became especially popular in the 1950s after being featured in widely distributed cream soup recipe campaigns that encouraged simple, one-dish cooking. It was simple, it was steady, and it always brought a quiet kind of relief. Creamed chicken biscuit bake. Cooked chicken. A can of cream soup. A splash of milk. A few canned biscuits. A small pinch of salt and pepper. That was all it took to turn a regular evening into something warm and filling. Margaret would shred the chicken first, then mix it with cream soup and milk until it became soft and smooth. She poured it into a baking dish, then placed raw biscuit dough right on top. As it baked, the biscuits rose slowly, soaking in the creamy base underneath while turning golden on the surface. It was the kind of meal that filled both the stomach and the kitchen with comfort. In 1955, a school cafeteria cook named Helen Brooks in Wichita, Kansas depended on this dish after long shifts feeding hundreds of children each day. She had worked in the school kitchen for nearly 20 years, always arriving before sunrise to prepare meals from scratch. At home, she kept things simple. This casserole was her favorite because it required little effort but still felt complete. She once said she liked watching the biscuits rise in the oven because it reminded her that small things could still grow into something enough. In 2024 dollars, this dish costs about $5.70 and feeds 6 people generously. It takes around 55 minutes to prepare and bake. For seniors, this meal provides protein from chicken, helping maintain strength and energy. Chicken and biscuit casseroles became popular in the 1950s as home cooks used refrigerated dough and canned soups to simplify dinner preparation. It was soft. It was steady. And it always rose to the occasion. Tomato rice ground beef skillet bake. Ground beef. A can of tomatoes. A small onion. A pinch of salt and pepper. That was all it took to create a full meal that could stretch across a crowded table. Margaret would start by browning the beef with onion until the kitchen filled with a simple, steady smell. Then she added the tomatoes and uncooked rice, stirring everything together so the grains could slowly absorb the liquid. She covered it and let it bake until the rice softened and the mixture thickened into a warm, cohesive dish. No extra steps. No unnecessary effort. Just food that worked. In 1959, a dock worker named Frank Delgado in Baltimore, Maryland depended on this meal after long days unloading cargo ships along the harbor. He had worked the same docks for over 18 years, often arriving home with salt still on his clothes and silence in his voice. His wife made this casserole on nights when time was short but the need was not. He used to say it felt like the whole day finally settled once he took the first bite. On some evenings, he would sit at the table long after finishing, just listening to the quiet. In 2024 dollars, this dish costs about $5.20 and feeds 6 people without struggle. It takes around 45 to 55 minutes to prepare and cook. For seniors, this meal provides potassium from tomatoes, supporting heart health and steady energy. Rice-based casseroles like this became common in the 1950s as one-pan meals spread through American households looking for simple, filling solutions. It was honest. It was dependable. And it always brought the day to a close in a good way. Margaret Collins eventually stopped cooking every night the same way as the years passed. The kitchen grew quieter, the children moved away, and the worn wooden table held fewer plates. But the casseroles never really left her life. They lived on in memory, in habits, and in the way she still measured meals by whether they could quietly bring people together. These dishes were never about luxury. They were about presence. About making sure no one sat at a table and felt forgotten. In every layered bake and simple casserole, there was a kind of dignity that did not need explanation. If you remember meals like these, tell me in the comments which one you grew up eating. I read every comment. And if you want more forgotten meals that built real American homes, subscribe to the channel.